We'll start off immediately with James Rodehaver, but first, actually, Liz, maybe you'll start off. Liz from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. James Rodehaver is with us, who is the head of the Myanmar team, who's joining us and will give us an update on the human rights situation in that country. But first, Liz.
Yes, good morning, everyone. This morning, our office has published its latest report on the human rights situation in Myanmar, detailing a range of serious violations that continue to underscore the deepening crisis and lack of rule of law throughout the country. Since the coup on the 1st of February 2021, at least 5,350 civilians have been killed, more than 3.3 million displaced, and over half the population are living below the poverty line, primarily due to military violence, according to the report. The report looks at the devastating impact of the violence, destruction and deprivation on people's mental health, as well as the regression in economic and social rights, which is precipitating further economic decline. At the same time, young people who provide the key to Myanmar's future are fleeing abroad to escape being forced to serve in or fight for the military. The report also documents the vast scope of detentions undertaken by the military. Nearly 27,400 individuals have been arrested since the coup, with arrests on the rise since the military's implementation of mandatory conscription in February 2024. Credible sources indicate that at least 1,853 have died in custody, including 88 children and 125 women. Many of these individuals have been verified as dying after being subjected to abusive interrogation, other ill treatment in detention, or denial of access to adequate health care. All those responsible for gross human rights violations and serious violations of international humanitarian law must be held accountable. The lack of any form of accountability for perpetrators is an enabler for the repetition of violations, abuses, and crimes. The enormity of the challenges Myanmar is facing and will face in the years ahead to ensure respect of the rule of law and functional justice institutions is daunting. In the light of the above findings, High Commissioner Volker Turk calls on the UN Security Council to refer the full scope of the current situation in Myanmar to the International Criminal Court. He reiterates his calls for an end to the violence and for the immediate and unconditional release of all those arbitrarily detained. Equally important for the future of Myanmar and its people, the grassroots efforts of civil society and community-based organisations to provide essential services, including mental health care, should also be specifically supported. I'll leave it there. We will be issuing the full note. I now hand over to James Rodehaver to add his details and, of course, to take your questions. Thank you. Over to you, James.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Liz and Rolando. It's a real pleasure to be here with all of you this morning. As Liz described, the report that we've put out today really is showing the extent to which Myanmar is plumbing the depths of a human rights abyss. And it really tries to encapsulate the human rights developments really over the last 15 months. This is a comprehensive report that was requested by the Human Rights Council. So the last time we released a report of this nature was in March of 2023. So in that intervening period, many things have happened. As Liz already described, there is a real deterioration due to violence and armed conflict in the country. The other side of that coin, however, is that there are massive regressions in human rights that have been provoked by a vacuum of rule of law. And that is something that the report tries to highlight in great detail. It is how the Myanmar military has created a crisis by instrumentalizing the legal system, criminalizing nearly all forms of dissent against its attempts to rule the country, It also has utilized the law enforcement and justice systems to conduct mass arrest campaigns. And one of the things we make clear in the report is that even though many people assume that the mass arrests were really a feature of 2021 and 2022, they continue to happen throughout the country. Over a third of the over 27,000 individuals that have been arrested for expressing dissent against the military, those arrests have been verified in the period that is in the report. So it is a phenomenon that still exists. But then, of course, you have what happens to those people once they are arrested. It is lengthy periods of pretrial detention in detention facilities that have horrific conditions. And then, of course, you have the pervasive use of torture and ill treatment. Detainees interviewed by our office described methods such as being suspended from the ceiling without food or water, being forced to kneel or crawl on hard or sharp objects, the introduction of animals such as snakes or insects or other wild animals in order to provoke fear and terror in individuals. Beating people with iron poles, bamboo sticks, batons, rifle butts, leather strips, electric wires, motorcycle chains, asphyxiation, mock executions, electrocution, and burning with tasers, lighters, cigarettes, and boiling water. Truly some of the most depraved behavior utilized as methods of torture in these detention centers. And there are, of course, extremely disturbing reports that we've also received of the use of sexual violence, both against male and female detainees. And these are incredibly difficult cases to confirm. But we have gotten such a number and such descriptions of these violations, we simply cannot ignore them. So that is the sort of the breadth of what we are calling the vacuum of rule of law in the country. The heavy-handed uses of justice institutions showing that they are not bound by the rule of law whatsoever. And so that is what we are encapsulating in the report is this persistent regression of human rights in almost every area in the full spectrum of rights. And so I'll leave it at that, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, both Liz and James, for that sobering information and for sharing the notes. We'll start off with questions in the room first, and then we have a couple online. But let's start off with Christiana of the German News Agency. Christiana.
Thank you very much. It's just for housekeeping. I'm not sure what report you are talking about. We didn't get any. And I can see one on the website that's dated 11th July. Is that the one? No.
No, this is a report that is being published today. This is the latest report that is, of the High Commissioner to the Human Rights Council, and it will be delivered at the Council on the 23rd of September in an interactive dialogue, but it's being put online and made publicly available today.
At some point today.
It should have been put up as of 9 a.m. It was when it should have been made available. Yeah.
We can add the link to the note that we send out as a matter of course, so my colleagues will be listening in and they can do that immediately.
Other questions in the room before we go online? No? Okay. Let's then turn to Gabby. Gabriel, nice to see you, Sotomayor of El Proceso.
Hola, I'm very happy to be here too. The situation that you are telling us is horrific. Lack of human rights, but lack of humanity. So what does the government of Myanmar think about your report? Are you in contact with them? What does they say about all these accusations that you are making? Thank you so much. And after I have two questions of another subject, please don't, when we finish Myanmar, thank you so much.
Sure, I'll come back to you, Gabby, for the other subjects, but let's maybe, James, you want to start us off? Yep.
Sure. Well, I don't have any comments about the government of Myanmar because there is none. You have a military run governmental apparatus that is not recognized either by the United Nations or by the vast majority of member states, and therefore, we do not call them a government. They are in control of less than 40% of the country at this point, and they are constantly losing ground to a variety of armed groups operating throughout the country, including in, most recently in Rakhine State and in Shan State, where they've been pushed back really to the very fringes of both of those ethnic states. They are losing control of territory, and of course, they've lost any credibility with the people of Myanmar. Now, we do share our reports with them before they are published. We have frequently asked them for inputs in our reports by communicating through their diplomatic services. But in terms of what they think of our reports, they always deny them. They have an official mouthpiece or an official publication that they put out daily called the Global New Light of Myanmar, and any criticism of their human rights record is always decried and dismissed summarily in that publication.
Thank you, James. Isabel of Spanish News Agency. Isabel.
Yes, good morning. Isabel for EFE. Could you describe, please, the situation, the living conditions of the population in the 60% of the country that are not under the control of the military-run government? How they satisfy the fundamental essential needs? How are the public services, if any, running? Health, education, and in what extent the population is, I don't know how to say, but I agree with what is happening in the sense that they feel the different armed groups as liberators of the country.
Well, of course, one of the big impacts of this crisis, that when the military seized power, was a collapse of public services, because a lot of the resistance to the military was firstly and foremost fueled by the civil service, and particularly the teachers, doctors, and lawyers in the country, trade unionists as well. And so you had many sectors of the governmental authority simply were unable to provide services from there on out because their employees stopped working. And even though the military threatened many civil servants with consequences if they did not return to work, many of them never did return. And so as a result, many of the schools do not operate. Now, in these areas where the ethnic armed groups and other groups are in control, it's a very difficult situation. You have public services primarily being provided by civil society and by humanitarian organizations. In some cases, you have the National Unity Government or other localized governmental entities that are run, or public service entities being run by the armed groups that provide some basic services. But throughout the country, I think you can describe this as a real humanitarian catastrophe in the making. You have over 18.6 million people assessed to be in humanitarian need, and over 15 million that are food insecure. And the vast majority of people that are accessible to the humanitarians are those who are not in conflict-affected areas. And one of the things the report talks about is that since late October last year, a lot of the country is in conflict. But one of the things the military has been very effective at is denying humanitarians access to those areas where people are in greatest need. Right now you have the situation in Rakhine State, where the military is fighting the Arakan army, and no one is really taking the initiative to provide extra protection or attention to ensure access by the humanitarians. And so you have huge segments of the displaced population, over 300,000 newly displaced individuals that are getting very little, if no, food assistance. There is starvation. There is health epidemics, watery diarrhea, serious health problems manifesting themselves throughout the conflict-affected areas of Rakhine State, and that includes the Rohingya population, which is, of course, they are the ones who always end up getting a lot of attention and focus, even though they, of course, have been specially targeted by the military, at times by the Arakan army. And so they're in a dire situation. But one of the things we do try to do in the report is spell out how in certain areas of the country you do have local community efforts to provide services. Particularly in this report, we talk about mental health services because there is such an acute need. With such a wide range of human rights violations, you need, mental health support because trauma is so acute. In our last report, we talked about governmental and governance being provided by local entities as well. So there is a real grassroots effort to sort of pick up the slack where you don't have a civil service or a functional government. Civil society is stepping into the fore.
Yes, very short. Yes, I lost the part where who is not allowing the international humanitarian access to people? Is both or armed groups or the military government or what?
In some cases, it's both, but it's primarily the military because, of course, the military is still controlling, the ports. Of course, the humanitarians are based in, Yangon and Sittwe and, the larger towns and cities, most of which are controlled by the military. So they need the military. First of all, they need a guarantee that their staff will not be targeted if they go out to deliver aid. But then they also have to get travel authorizations. They have to be able to get customs clearances. They have to be allowed to conduct bank transfers in order to pay for the assistance. And of course, the military has restricted a lot of that to make it nearly impossible. Now, in recent weeks, in recent months, you have the phenomenon too, where a lot of humanitarian storage facilities are being targeted. They're being looted and sacked, and in some cases then burned thereafter. And at times, it's hard to know for certain who is doing that, but we do know in some cases the military has done it. We suspect in other cases there might be other actors behind it as well, maybe even criminal actors. But the thing is, humanitarians are not being given that open access to meet really dire needs of the people.
Thank you very much, James. Okay, we'll go online now. Maya Plentz of the UN Brief has a question. Go ahead, Maya.
Good morning. Thank you for taking my question, Rolando. My question is about Facebook. Is Facebook and Twitter still being used in the country as it was established by a UN Human Rights Office report a while back? The violence towards the Rohingya was made through the platform Facebook. Which is actually the sole and was the sole provider of access to the internet. And what does the report says about questions of these tech companies' role in contributing to the violence in real life and also the peace and security situation? This is not new. Does it continue? And also during the 2017 violence wave, there was that displaced 700,000 people. Facebook did not have an office in the country, nor moderators in the local language.
Yeah. Well, we don't say much about hate speech and how social media is being used to stoke violence in this particular report. What we do talk about is, first of all, the way in which communications and social media have been restricted. There's a heavy surveillance now of people that use social media. There are attempts to ban VPNs and other security software that allows people to use social media anonymously. And then, of course, there are the massive areas of the country that have been blacked out from any communications. And that is actually one of the ways that the military, again, tries to keep people from being able to run away or to seek protection, is to cut off communications of any sort. They cut off mobile data, internet service provisions, and in some cases, phone lines. And they do that specifically to keep, people from being able to flee or to run away. They also try to do it to disrupt the communications of their armed opponents as well. But what that does also is it makes it very difficult at times to get information out about violations whenever they occur. And of course, since the military is using airstrikes, artillery strikes, and now, of course, not only are the military, but also the armed groups are using drones to conduct large-scale attacks, we're seeing civilian casualties result at levels that Myanmar has never seen before. But it's very hard to verify the extent of a lot of those attacks because of these shutdowns of communication. Now, the military has done other things to also stoke racial tensions and interethnic tensions, and they've done that through introducing, for example, forced conscription. Going to, for example, the Rohingya community. And we've talked about this in past reports, where they are essentially going to the Rohingya community and saying, you have to fight for us. And if you don't fight for us, we will make sure you don't get food. We will make sure that you don't get services of any sort. But if you do fight for us, maybe we'll consider things like giving you educational opportunities or money or even citizenship. And so they have played upon the fears and desires of different ethnic communities, and that has sown, interethnic violence, because now you have one community fighting against another because they feel they either have no choice or because they're being enticed to do it.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, we have a question from Nick of the New York Times. Nick.
Thanks, and hi, James. Good to see you in Geneva. Two questions. In relation to sexual violence, is this being perpetrated mainly by the military? And is it kind of just random brutality by units in the field? Or are you seeing this as something that's more systematic and something that's also being undertaken by prison authorities themselves, who aren't necessarily military? A second question is the vacuum in law and order that you discussed. How far does that also apply in the 60% of the country, which is under the control of different ethnic armed entities? There have been some pretty disturbing reports about human rights violations, for example, in Sagaing. And we also saw the drone attack on the Rohingya, which I think was attributed mainly to AA. So how much is that a concern also on the part of your office? Thanks.
Thank you. I mean, the report covers sexual violence as it's being used in detention, particularly as a form of torture or a form of coercion. And so that is how the report talks about it. Now, we receive reports and allegations that it is happening as well on the ground during ground operations by different troops. At times, it's hard to know who the perpetrators are, but most of our reports have been about this being used by the military, and that includes in recent attacks in Rakhine State, including attacks in Sitwe and Tanwe and other areas of Rakhine State. So the problem, though, is, again, these communications cutoffs, and of course, anytime you're dealing with victims of sexual violence, it's very difficult to interview them in a responsible way that really does no harm, particularly whenever you're not there with the victim and you can't refer them to medical help or psychosocial services or other things. So at times it's very hard to know the full extent of first of all, the veracity of the reports, but also the extent to which they are systematically happening. So we haven't been as categorical as we should be if we did have access to the ground, or could be if we had access on the ground. Now, in terms of the extent of the vacuum of rule of law, I mean, yes, there is a problem, I think, throughout the country. Each armed group sort of provides a police service or a security service in their own way. There is no parallel police force that covers all of these 60% of the areas. So what's being done right now is very ad hoc, and that, of course, is dangerous, because there are a lot of, first of all, in combat, there are a lot of soldiers that end up surrendering. And so how they're being treated in detention, how they're being, that is very much a blind spot that we have. We don't know. But then also how they enforce security on the ground with civilians is, it's hard to know at times, because when you do talk to the civilians in some of these areas, they're very scared. They don't want to talk about these groups that they do see as having liberated them from the military. But now, their security still has not improved appreciably, or as much as you would like.
Thank you very much, James. We'll take one last question. We do have our guest is in the room, initially our first briefer, but we have time for maybe one last question. Gabby, once again, this is still on Myanmar, yes?
No, it's on the other subject.
Okay,
I
in that
told-
case, we've exhausted the questions, and thank you very much, James. You're welcome to come back anytime. It's nice to see you, my friend. Liz, I think you'll be sticking around, but thank you very much for your intervention as well.